sort of thing.
Yeah. So smoke.
It's claim it. The Ohio Department.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. So smoke.
It's claim it. The Ohio Department.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. So smoke.
Impacts them for a variety of reasons: their personal safety, their well-being, stability in their communities. And instills fear, and it affects the community economically, and just as a whole, it creates a bad image on the community.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Protecting What Matters. I'm your host, Andy Ellinger, and today we're going to discuss the crime of arson, how it impacts your community, and what we can all do to stop it. Joining me today is Josh Hobbs, Bureau Chief for the Division of State Fire Marshal's Fire and Explosion Investigation Bureau. How are you doing today, Josh?
Doing well, thanks.
Arson is a destructive act which involves setting fire to property and can result in devastating consequences, including loss of life, property damage, and economic issues. The intentional setting of fires can cause fear and terror and can be used to intimidate or harm. That's what we're talking about today. Josh, why should Ohio citizens care about the subject of arson?
Well, it impacts them for a variety of reasons: their personal safety, their well-being, stability in their communities. And instills fear, and it affects the community economically, and just as a whole, it creates a bad image on the community, whether it's their fault, regardless of who's at fault, I should say. And property damage obviously affects insurance rates, and there's just a downhill effect with arson in the community. So I think it attracts media, and that's obviously what village, city officials, county officials don't want. So there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things and a lot of factors that come to bear then.
Yeah, I think that covers it. I mean, kind of obvious why you don't want arson in your community, for sure. Without sharing any of your proprietary investigative techniques, just how does the State Fire Marshal's Fire and Explosion Investigations Bureau investigate their cases to determine whether a fire has been intentionally set?
So we have some guides that we use, and in NFPA 921, it's a guide for fire and explosion investigations. It kind of sets forth that you shall use the scientific method in order to investigate your fires, and a lot of that is a systematic process that you work from the area of least damage to the area of most damage. But what you also look at is some deductive reasoning. You're trying to eliminate potential causes. You're not going to come to a really rapid conclusion. You're going to try to eliminate all those things as you complete that circle. It's kind of a continuous circle into that area of origin. And in that process, you're eliminating a lot of the other factors that could have contributed to that fire. So we try to be very objective and look at things kind of from a global perspective before coming to a real quick conclusion, because a lot of times fire can give some false indicators. Oftentimes fire patterns can fool you because there's been what we call a lot of times a phenomena drop down, things falling on the floor, given secondary fire patterns. When the fire ventilates early, where the fire ventilates first is often an area of great damage, and so we have to find out where that fire vented first. We're always looking at the witness observation is huge, so we're looking at where did you see fire first? Fire breaks out a really large bay window. There's going to be a real pronounced fire pattern in that area because that's where the fire first got its big chunk of oxygen from the outside. So we have to take all those things into consideration before you kind of narrow things down. So it's not all what it seems early on, and we don't investigate the fire without talking to the first responders, the 911 caller, the people that first saw the fire in its early stages. We always, as the public information officer, we're always asking for video, anything the public has, because we're trying to see how that fire behaved, if you will. And we really focus on that before we make any judgments as to even the origin of the fire, let alone the cause.
I can't even imagine walking up to a devastated area from a fire and being able to piece together that evidence. What are the challenges that these investigators face to gather this evidence to put this case together?
The scene safety is probably the number one thing. So when fire is destructive, the condition of the structure is oftentimes a challenge. Probably half of the fires we investigate, we can't get where we want to be. I wouldn't say half, probably a little less than that, but we can't get. We do a lot of total loss fires. We can't get into that area of origin oftentimes because it's unsafe. The origin of the fire has been devastated or is considered a pile of ash, if you will. And so that's a very problematic for us from an investigative standpoint. And we're not going to put anybody at risk, to try to collect a piece of evidence, but yet we try as hard as we can to get that crucial evidence. We're relying more on technology, obviously the use of canines and different things to help us in some certain areas. We're documenting areas of fire scenes that we previously couldn't document with the use of drones, 360 cameras, and things like that we are able to see some things we previously wouldn't have been able to see years ago, which also helps our investigation. So it's a lot of times the devastation, the structural collapses, things like that. Oftentimes we'll be relying on the insurance companies to come in when they bring heavy equipment to remove some of the debris to make it safe for us, or perhaps if it's a large-scale incident, ATF would perhaps bring things, pay for some excavation material or excavation equipment, and that's sometimes critical for us on a really large scene, is to be able to remove debris to get to that area. But like I said earlier, a lot of times it's just not safe. And document with the use of drones, 360 cameras, and things like that.
Thanks for listening to Protecting What Matters from the Ohio Department of Commerce. We are your resource for all safety information for your home or business. Here's a quick safety message reminder from the Ohio State Fire Marshal's office.
So smoke alarms, we want to make sure we're putting those on each level of the house. Each bedroom that you're at, where anybody sleeps, put that inside that bedroom, and then outside where the people sleep. They're important because what you typically have is that early activation, early notification of something happening, in this case smoke building up, and that usually is what tells you that there's a fire happening. So having those placed in those locations that are appropriate, making sure that you're checking the alarms themselves about once a month just to make sure that they're working. Change the batteries on them, we like to say twice a year right now. And then after 10 years, those entire alarms are going to need replaced.
For more information on the State Fire Marshal, visit our website at com.ohio.gov/fire. And be sure to check out some of our previous podcast episodes on all podcast platforms.
Each level of the house, each bedroom that you're at, where anybody sleeps, put that outside.
We're back with Protecting What Matters. I'm your host, Andy Ellinger, and we are discussing the crime of arson with Josh Hobbs, the Bureau Chief for the Division of State Fire Marshal's Fire and Explosion Investigations Bureau. Let's continue talking about the investigative process. Josh, how long does a typical fire investigation take? Is there a typical fire investigation?
Not really. Most of them, if evidence has been collected, you're going to have a period where that evidence is analyzed by the forensic lab here at the State Fire Marshal's office. You're going to continue to interview witnesses. You're going to continue to, you may be even relying on some examinations done by the private sector to eliminate, electrical appliances or anything within the structure, since that's not something we do here. So there's a period in which there's a wait period, if you will, while things are being analyzed. Sometimes fires are what they are. I mean, we have fires that are quickly known to be incendiary. An arrest is rapidly made. We just had one last night where an arrest was rapidly made, so where we know what happened. But oftentimes we go through that process that I mentioned earlier to make sure we do things right. But there are investigations that remain open for years. There are investigations that are closed within, a few days.
Now, based on some of your data and your stats, in 2020, your investigators had 725 cases. 179 were incendiary. We're using words like incendiary, intentionally set, foul play, arson, kind of interchangeably here, but that's if it's an incendiary fire, it's an intentionally set fire, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So in 2020, you had investigators looking at 725 fires. 179 were incendiary. In 21, 812 cases with 182 incendiary, and in 2022, 953 total cases with almost 200 incendiary. So it seems to be that arson's on the rise over the last few years, but so are your total Bureau investigations. So can we reasonably make any correlation, or can we draw any information from these stats that we're talking about?
So I think it's pretty steady, but I do think one of the bigger things is the concealment of crime by fire. Using fire to conceal crime is something that's just, I think, over the years steadily increased because of crime scene television, things of that nature, and the fact that forensic capabilities are so much more advanced now than they were years ago, that you set fire to cover up the crime predicate act that you've committed. So I think a lot of times that is where we see an increase. We also have an increase in, I would think, I think in violent crimes with the use of fire, fire being used as a tool of violence. I think we have a little bit more of that now because, as we know, I mean, nationally we're seeing that, a lot of trends. Basically anything that's a criminal trend nationally parallels itself with us fire-wise. So we're dealing with more mental health issues. That's a big deal nationwide, right? We're dealing with more violent crime surrounding fire. People using fire as a weapon, tool of violence. We're seeing more crime concealment. I don't think there's any drastic curve, but I do think it's a steady incline.
Is there a psychological profile of someone who would set a fire? It sounds like it could run the gamut.
It can run the gamut. Yeah, a lot of times there's been traumatic events sometime earlier in their life, and I've seen them. People who were sexually abused. In the course of my career, I've seen people, end up being set fires and later in their life become sexual predators, and it's a cycle. I've seen people that have just a basic fascination with fire. I've also seen, and the unfortunate, the volunteer firefighter thing. We do have that, or a firefighter or a first responder that sets fires. I mean, it's an unfortunate thing, but it happens. But I do think it's a steady incline. Not drastic, but
It's your money. Come and claim it.
Who would set a
a lot of times there's been
The Ohio
earlier
Department
in
of Commerce
their
Division
life
of
and people who were
Unclaimed
sexually
Funds is
abused,
currently safeguarding more than
end up being
$3
later in their life
billion
become,
in unclaimed funds. So there's a good chance you or someone you know has money waiting to
with
be
fire.
claimed.
I've also
Just head over to our
unfortunate, the
website,
volunteer have that or a firefighter
unclaimedfunds.ohio.gov, to search
that-
your name,
that
the name of a
sets
family
fires. I
member
mean,
or a
it's an
loved one
unfortunate
to
thing,
see
but
if you
it
have an
happens.
unclaimed fund.
It's a steady.
We're back with Protecting What Matters. I'm your host, Andy Ellinger, and we're still discussing the crime of arson with Josh Hobbs, the Bureau Chief for the Division of State Fire Marshal's Fire and Explosion Investigation Bureau. So you discover fire and determine it's incendiary. You identify a suspect. What are the legal consequences for that perpetrator?
So the crime of arson is kind of defined really simply in the Ohio Revised Code, of creating or causing a substantial risk of serious physical harm to either the property of another or a person or persons, basically. So you have arson, you have really two basic tenets. You have arson, you have aggravated arson. Aggravated arson can also be segued into an attempted aggravated murder. It can be segued into felonious assault. And arson can also kind of be downplayed into a vandalism or a criminal damaging. So there's a lot of different things there. But the crime of arson itself, if you set fire to a vacant property that's not maintained as an occupied structure, that's a fourth-degree felony most of the time. You set fire to an occupied structure. Let's say someone's house is set on fire. They're not home at the time. Generally, an aggravated arson is a second-degree felony. If there's occupants in the house and you've posed what's called a substantial risk of physical harm to another human being, and there's 5 people in that house, you can technically be charged with a second-degree felony for setting the house on fire and 5 first-degree felonies for putting each one of those individuals at risk. Some prosecutors can look at that as, if they look at the intent of the individual and they take the totality of circumstances into effect, they may end up charging them 5 counts of attempted aggravated murder, 5 counts of felonious assault. But aggravated arson is generally the basic charge for that. When insurance fraud comes in, we talk to arson for a profit. Insurance fraud is based on dollar amount, but generally that's a 3rd degree felony for majority insurance fraud we deal with on top of the fire. So, but the most general charges you're gonna see in a case is arson or aggravated arson. Property damage, if it's really low, if it's a mine, if it's a shed or something like that, you may see that a vandalism charge or a criminal damaging type charge. But obviously we have a lot of aggravated arson cases and aggravated murder cases, things like that on the other end of the spectrum.
If we can kick back to, you mentioned canines. So the type of canines that we have here for the Investigations Bureau, 2 kinds. What are they and how do they help?
Accelerant detection canine and explosive detection canine. So the accelerant detection canine is an investigative tool. They are an animal. We don't view them as just a tool, but they're an animal. Live with the investigator 24/7. Their job is to help detect the presence of ignitable liquids on a fire scene. The misconception about that tool, that dog, is that we turn them loose inside of a structure and they just go find the area of origin for us, like like they're seeking out, a human being.
Like magic.
Like magic. We do not deploy those dogs until the scene is excavated and the area of origin is determined. So their job within the structure or within the fire scene should be relatively short. And they are going to do a cursory search of the area in which the fire, we believe, started, and they're going to try to, determine, where that ignitable liquid may potentially be in that area, and they're going to, alert, and samples will subsequently be taken from the areas in which they alert. Their noses are extremely sensitive, and oftentimes they will alert to even the, the actual wood matrix of a laminate floor or hardwood flooring. They actually have ignitable liquids basically based within those floors, as part of their matrix. Their noses are sensitive, so a lot of times the lab sorts all that out, so it's not a false indication or anything like that. They're just a very, very, very. It's kind of it's impressive when you get into the science of a dog's nose when it comes to accelerants. It's unbelievable what they can detect and how strong their olfactory senses really are. So the explosive detection canine's job is much more physical in nature. You're looking for an unknown explosive device, and it could be in an entire building when you're also sweeping proactively. And then also on the post-blast investigation, that's where that dog is extremely beneficial. So they're finding pieces of debris from a device, right? Or even in a fireworks explosion, you're looking for where that debris has traveled from that fireworks explosion. How far has that debris gone? So the dog's task is very physical, and that's why oftentimes you'll see the explosive detection canines working in a group of dogs, not individually, because it's so physically demanding. 2 or 3 of them will respond to a particular incident. So our dog oftentimes is just one of multiple dogs going to an incident. So that's why a lot of times our dog handler on Steeman will actually put his dog in on a treadmill, just to maintain a physical capability. So the accelerant detection canine's job is very pinpointed, where the explosive detection canine's job is rather broad, and she's a play reward versus the accelerant detection canines are food reward dogs. So she's rewarded with a toy, where they're rewarded with food. So those are different styles of getting dogs motivated to work. But yeah, they're amazing tools, and it all comes down to their noses, right? Mm-hmm. Their noses. So, and they're just getting into the science of it. Like I said, it's pretty impressive.
So when it comes to stopping arsons, one of the things I was thinking was fire safety education, preventing maybe accidental fires being started or intentional arsons. I was thinking more from a youth fire setter intervention. Mm-hmm. Have you seen success in that area, or are there other fire safety education that might limit arsons or accidental fires being set?
So I've seen some juvenile fire setter successes where it was just a kid being a little bit inquisitive by setting fire and then getting quick intervention over the years, and those kids never heard from them again. Mm-hmm. I've also seen some juvenile fire setter situations where it is the beginning of something worse, and is a reflection of perhaps the lifestyle they live or something that's been traumatic in their life. Also, the prevention of fires. A lot of times, if we see something very consistent, investigatively, we relay that information to the Fire Prevention Bureau here to let them know we're seeing a consistent, pattern here. And we've attacked smoking while on oxygen pretty hard at the Fire Marshal's office. I know that we were relaying that this was a epidemic level situation to prevention, who then kind of started really getting aggressive with that. But we were starting to see this massive uptick, especially post-COVID. And during COVID and post-COVID, we saw a huge uptick, and so we're relaying that information to prevention. We also, Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, also inquires a lot about product safety issues. When there's a fire fatality or a juvenile injured in a fire, they're wanting to know what we know, although we don't evaluate, I would say space heaters. We don't evaluate those things hard because that's not our job. We don't evaluate the inner workings of those things. But if we have a consistent issue with, hey, we've seen this particular brand multiple times, it was just happened to be the brand that was, in the origin of the fire, near the origin of the fire, we may convey that, hey, we have seen half a dozen of these, or if we have a particular problem, we will convey that to them, or they will already have asked. But all times we'll relay some information. You may want to know this. We're seeing a bunch of this. So we also do things like that. What little bit of proactive stuff we get to do, those are kind of the bulk of the things we do, is the transferring of information to prevention, and also the relaying of information to CPSC, whether they've asked for it or whether we've seen something.
Well, another prevention is, let's talk a little bit about the Blue Ribbon Arson Committee and their ongoing $5,000 reward to help combat the crime of arson. How's that helped as a tool?
That's a really good incentive to come forward with information. Oftentimes, it's even bolstered with the local Crime Stopper rewards as well. But the Blue Ribbon Arson Committee, goes back decades, obviously, and I'm a member of the committee, and we evaluate case-by-case basis of the information that's provided to investigators, and it requires a conviction of the person, or person's responsible. But the more serious the crime, the more valuable the information, the larger the reward. So we give rewards up to $5,000, and the real serious crimes will get $5,000 to individuals. We've even given $5,000 to multiple people, but we've also given as low as $500 for very minor incidents. So, but it's a very valuable thing, because when you post that sign, you're asking people to call our tip line, our 800 number, and to provide information. And generally speaking, most people don't believe the information they have is significant. And generally, it's far more significant than what they think it is. I would venture to say a majority of people who have information dismiss it as, minor. But a lot of times we already have 75%, we need the other 25. Or we have 60, we need the 40. And they have the 40, and they don't think it's much, but it is generally what we need. And so I always say people don't think they have much, but generally anything is good.
Yeah, so a guy, they might have seen a guy with a gas can walking by, but they didn't see him set the fire. But
right.
But they saw a guy with a gas can, and they don't think it's important.
Right.
Oh,
we
okay.
know the fire was set with maybe say we've got positive samples for gasoline, and we knew there was a male subject seen leaving the house. We don't have the gas can in his hand, right?
Yeah.
But you saw him walking down the street with one.
Yes.
That puts the puzzle together.
So yeah, that seems to go hand in hand with the State Fire Marshal's tip line. This is a tip line that's manned 24/7, 365, 1-800-589-2728. And from what I'm hearing, there is no level of detail too large or too small to share in a intentionally set fire. If you've seen something, you should say something.
Yeah.
If you saw something.
I would say 8 out of 10 times the people that give us information, they've hesitated for quite a while to give it. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty common.
So if our listener encounters a situation where someone intentionally set a fire, what should they do? How should they handle that?
They should pick up the phone, and sometimes we may not have investigated that fire. Majority of the state's major fires we do outside the major municipalities. But our 800 number, we will get the information to the appropriate authorities if we didn't investigate the fire. It's more simple to get that through our 800 number and call in because, we can, between prevention and our office, can determine who investigated that fire and when it happened, and we can get that information vetted and then sent to the appropriate, whether it's our investigator or whatever. I think that's extremely important. But don't be afraid to make that call. Oftentimes, the person giving information is one of many. It's just different pieces. So a lot of times people fear retribution. Seen very little of that happen over the years. People have that fear, but it's not as, the person who set the fire is scared of being caught for setting that fire, let alone setting more fires. I'm not saying that's all the time, but greater chance that's the case. So we have that a lot. So I would obviously encourage them to make that call, and that sign does not even have to be posted. If somebody comes forward of their own volition and provides information, critical information, we can still give them a reward at the discretion of the investigator to submit that to the Blue Ribbon Arson Committee. Although we post those signs, and that's for a specific reason, the committee evaluates even people who have provided information without the sign being up because it was the right thing to do. They're being rewarded for doing something, productive towards the prosecution of someone, conviction of someone. So, and I would also, going back to an earlier thing, our investigators have to, what people don't understand too is our investigators have to type a very detailed report, and they spend a lot of time behind their computer trying to make that things presentable to the prosecutor. I think it's probably people underestimate how much of a product we have to put together to get in 2023 to get an arson conviction. Quite a product that we have to put together with everything from Ring doorbell footage, which is the new trend. We are constantly, collecting Ring doorbell footage. That has been the biggest change in fire investigation in the last few years, is the Ring doorbell footage of either the suspect there or walking by the house, or the Ring doorbell catches the early stages of a fire across the street. And so we're grabbing that and getting that downloaded, and we're enhanced by our forensic lab. There's surveillance video everywhere now. So all those things have to be packaged up in our case file now. The cell phone data from the suspect, and a Facebook profile of the suspect, an Instagram profile. All these things are an expectation for prosecution now, because that tells the entire story. So going out and just doing that fire scene and talking to some people is not the case anymore. Now there is a ton of work. So a lot of times people get frustrated. Well, why is this taking so long? Or why is this case still open? Well, there's a lot of things going on, and there's a lot more to a fire investigation in 2023 than there was in 1983. I'll tell you that. And the science has changed, but also the amount of work that goes into a routine residential fire investigation. And that's why we're constantly going to be needing more investigators, over the years, as Marshal Reardon, and we've discussed all this. It's the evolution of the fire investigation process and what's expected of us now. The more science that's out there, the more detail you're supposed to get into, and the more things you need to collect to paint the picture. It's not arson because the fire marshal said so anymore. It's just not. So
We've covered a lot about arson. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to discuss on this topic today?
Not that I can think of.
Well, I would really like to thank you, Josh. This has been Josh Hobbs, the Bureau Chief for the Division of State Fire Marshal Fire and Explosion Investigation Bureau, for joining me today. Thank you very much for your time on this critically important issue.
Thank you.
By caring about the crime of arson and taking proactive measures to prevent it, Ohio citizens can work together to create safer and more resilient communities for everyone. Encouraging fire safety education, supporting law enforcement efforts, and fostering a sense of community and watchfulness can help in deterring arson and ensuring the well-being of all residents. If you see something, say something. For more information on arson and the Division of State Fire Marshal's Fire and Explosion Investigations Bureau, visit our website, com.ohio.gov/fire.